I am reminded of the deeply touching letters, cards, and messages which so many of you have sent my wife.
Buckingham Palace is reeling after reports surfaced that King Charles has exiled Queen Camilla to a secret monastery.
This is also a time of change for my family.
Following a disastrous scandal that allegedly ruined one of his most important royal events. What was meant to be a proud, historic moment for the monarchy turned into utter chaos, leaving the king humiliated and furious. Insiders claim the fallout was so severe that Charles had no choice but to act swiftly and decisively. But what exactly did Camilla do? Today, we expose the shocking truth behind this royal exile. The night the crown trembled. The story that set Windsor whispering didn't begin with a decree or a headline. It began with smoke. Thick, curling smoke rising from the royal study, carrying the scent of burning parchment and pride. Inside that quiet, centuries-old room, Queen Camilla stood before the fireplace, the flames painting her face in shades of crimson and gold. Clutched in her hand was the official plan for the upcoming state banquet honoring German President Frank-Walter Steinmeier, an event that had taken weeks of meticulous royal coordination. And before the ink of approval had even dried, Camilla struck a match. By the time King Charles arrived, it was too late. The heavy doors swung open just as he saw the royal crest curling in the firelight, the papers turning to ash. His voice was tight, half disbelief, half fury. "Camilla, what have you done?" Her reply was calm, but cutting. "I'm rewriting my place, Charles. I will not stand beside you like a silent decoration." It wasn't defiance alone. It was a declaration. What followed that night was chaos cloaked in silence. Staff, sworn to secrecy, exchanged anxious glances as word slipped through the corridors. The Queen had burned the sovereign's documents. The King had stripped her of authority. By dawn, the palace that once moved with military precision now operated like a ghost, careful, fearful, uncertain which way the crown would tilt next. Outside, Windsor lay under a mist, as if the castle itself wished to hide. Charles, they say, spent that morning pacing his private chambers, staring out toward the gardens. Rain tapped against the glass while he struggled to craft a statement that could calm the storm without revealing the blaze. When the royal office finally spoke, the announcement was brief. Preparations for the banquet would proceed under the king's direct supervision. Not a single mention of Camilla. In royal language, silence speaks volumes. Across the corridor, Camilla sat awake, her candle burning low. Servants whispered she hadn't slept, only stared into the flickering light. The shadows on her face carried both defiance and heartbreak. To some, she looked strong. To others, utterly broken. Both may have been true. Because what burned that night wasn't just parchment. It was the fragile peace that had held the royal marriage together. Those close to the palace whisper of what drove her to such extremes. Years of restraint, years of being politely sidelined, of feeling like a footnote in the grand narrative of the monarchy. Even crowned, Camilla was never truly free of ghosts, especially the one whose portrait hung in that very study. Diana's serene face seemed to watch from the frame as the argument unfolded, her eyes flickering in the light, silently judging. Some claim Charles glanced at that portrait as the papers burned, and for a brief, haunting moment, the room froze. After that night, nothing felt the same. The palace routine resumed, smiles returned, and the German president was received with royal grace. But behind every polished gesture lay tension too deep to hide. Camilla attended, but her name was missing from the printed program, her presence politely ignored in official photographs. The crowd saw perfection, insiders saw fracture. Rumors spread that Charles had quietly restricted her access to state matters, ensuring no further revisions could occur. Yet whispers also told of Camilla building her own small circle of loyal aides. people who believed her rebellion wasn't madness, but a message. "A crowned woman," she reportedly said, "must choose between dignity and power. I've made my choice." What truly burned that October night was more than paper. It was an illusion. The monarchy, built on composure and silence, had revealed a crack that no amount of ceremony could conceal. Charles walked away from the fire, clutching the royal seal, his hands trembling, realizing his greatest challenge wasn't foreign diplomacy. It was the battle within his own home. And somewhere, in that same dim study where ashes still clung to the hearth, Camilla whispered to herself, almost like a vow, "I won't let anyone extinguish this fire." Whether that flame signaled rebellion or ruin, no one could yet tell. But as rain washed over Windsor's stone walls, one question echoed through every corridor. What truly drives a queen to set her own crown aflame? Could this storm within Windsor's walls reveal more than just royal unrest? Let's dive into the secrets that turned whispers into a kingdom's breaking point. The Silent Rebellion of Windsor. The tension in Windsor that week was thick enough to touch. Beneath the scent of fresh carnations and the gleam of polished floors, something darker was stirring. A quiet storm no one dared to name. It didn't begin with anger, at least not openly. It began with a meeting meant to unite the royal family under one purpose: a grand welcome for German President Frank-Walter Steinmeier and his wife. The event marked 27 years since such a meeting between the two nations, and King Charles saw it as a defining moment of his reign. Yet, what he considered a symbol of unity would soon ignite something far more personal. Morning light streamed through the tall windows of the royal reception room, striking a table draped in crimson velvet. Stacks of documents lay in perfect order, and the staff stood poised, pens ready. Charles spoke with calm authority, his voice echoing through the polished hall. "This isn't just diplomacy," he began. "It's the image of Britain we're presenting to Europe." His gaze moved across the table. William, Anne, the Princess of Wales, and finally, Queen Camilla. He began assigning roles. William, with his steady charm, would lead the ceremonies and the opening toast. Anne, ever disciplined, would oversee security with the Foreign Office. Kate, poised, modern, and adored by the public, would manage the press and imagery. "The spotlight will naturally be on you," Charles added with a faint smile. Then came the pause, a brief, loaded silence before he continued. "Camilla," he said evenly, "you'll handle the banquet seating and reception room decorations." A seemingly small task. Yet in that instant, it felt like an insult carved into marble. The kind of slight only someone who's fought too hard for her place could truly feel. Camilla's gloved hands trembled slightly, though her face remained composed. William avoided her gaze. Anne adjusted her notes, and Kate offered a polite nod. No one spoke, but everyone sensed the sudden chill in the air. To outsiders, the Queen's role might have seemed fitting, even graceful, but to Camilla, it was a reminder of where she stood. For years, she had endured whispers, headlines, and humiliation to be beside Charles. She had weathered the public scorn, the comparisons, the pity. And now, in this bright Windsor room, her husband had reduced her to arranging flowers and chair placements. When the meeting ended, the others left swiftly, their footsteps fading down the corridor. Camilla stayed seated, staring at the paper before her. Her name, listed last, even below Kate's, seemed to glow like a quiet betrayal. The clock ticked steadily as she whispered, "Reception room decorations." The words dripped with irony. A queen in name, but not in command. By noon, Windsor was alive with frantic preparations. Servants hurried through corridors with trays of crystal glassware. Florists debated shades of roses. Secretaries answered phones non-stop. Yet Camilla remained behind closed doors. The tea brought to her went untouched. In the mirror, her reflection appeared calm, regal even, but her eyes betrayed her. Beneath the practiced smile burned a slow, quiet anger. Not from one insult, but from years of being underestimated. Her trusted aide, Mrs. Hill, hesitated before speaking. "Your Majesty," she murmured, "shall I confirm the seating arrangements with His Majesty?" Camilla's tone was soft, almost playful. "No need, Mrs. Hill. Meetings are meetings. Decisions are decisions." She paused, her voice sharpening. "But tonight, we'll arrange things differently." Those who knew her said it wasn't the words that were unsettling. It was the way she said them, calm, certain, like a woman who had finally stopped waiting for approval. That evening, long after Windsor's corridors had quieted, Camilla's private office lights burned on. The hum of the staff faded, replaced by the sound of paper rustling, chairs moving, names being swapped on cards that would decide who sat where. To anyone watching, it was a small act, petty even. But within palace walls, such acts carried meaning. It was her way of reclaiming control, however quietly. When dawn broke, Windsor looked as perfect as Charles had hoped. Yet behind the flawless order, something had shifted. A rift, silent but growing, had taken root. The Queen had done her duty, yes, but on her own terms. And as the grand doors opened to welcome the German delegation, Camilla stood beside her husband with her usual poise, the image of royal composure. But behind the calm smile was a mind already set on something that would change Windsor's quiet balance forever. Because humiliation, once planted in a heart like hers, doesn't fade. It grows, patiently, powerfully, waiting for the perfect moment to bloom. What hidden storm was already brewing behind those palace walls? Let's dive into the night, when silence at Windsor turned into the spark of something far greater. The night Windsor burned. The evening at Windsor Castle was meant to be uneventful, another polished chapter in the life of a king preparing for yet another grand royal banquet. Outside, the lawns shimmered under the fading gold of the sun. Inside, silence stretched through the ancient corridors, disturbed only by the distant hum of servants preparing for the German president's upcoming visit. But somewhere beyond those polished doors, something far less ceremonial was unfolding. A moment that would leave a scar deeper than any public scandal. King Charles believed he had everything under control that day. The plans were finalized, the speeches approved, and the schedule polished to perfection. Yet, in a quiet study nearby, Queen Camilla sat alone at her desk, reading through the final version of the banquet program. Her eyes scanned the lines once, then again, until the truth hit her with cruel precision. Not a single word acknowledged her. No role, no title, no speech. In the pages that defined the state's most prestigious evening, Queen Camilla had been erased. That discovery, as small as it seemed, ignited something that had long been smoldering inside her. The years of being tolerated, but never truly honored. The countless public appearances where she smiled, while whispers followed her every move. All of it suddenly coiled into one sharp moment of defiance. Those who later tried to piece together what happened would call it the 10-minute rebellion, a brief but unforgettable eruption that changed everything. By the time the palace lights dimmed and the corridors quieted, a storm was already forming behind closed doors. When Charles returned to the library after a late call with the Prime Minister, he noticed something strange, a faint flicker glowing from under the study door. It wasn't candlelight. It was too sharp, too alive. He stepped inside. Before him stood Camilla, still and unflinching, her pale hair catching the glow of a rising fire. In her hand, the state banquet file, the one he had signed earlier that day, the same one that had excluded her name. With deliberate calm, She took a pen, crossed out, "Approved by His Majesty King Charles III," and replaced it with slow, deliberate strokes. "Her Majesty, Queen Camilla, presiding." Then, without a word, she sealed the page with the royal crest and threw the entire document into the flames. The papers curled instantly, their edges glowing orange before collapsing into ash. Charles froze. Anger, disbelief, and something close to grief crossed his face. "You've just burned your own dignity," he said quietly. Camilla didn't flinch. Her voice was steady, almost serene. "Dignity," she replied, "is for those who are seen. I'm just reclaiming what was taken from me." The words hung in the air like smoke, heavy, inescapable. Between them the fire roared, no longer a symbol of warmth, but of separation. Charles tried to seize the royal seal from her hand, but she didn't resist. Instead, she smiled faintly, her gaze locked on the rising flames. "You can put out the fire," she whispered, "but not the memory." It was said later that the blaze was small, contained within the hearth, but what it destroyed couldn't be replaced. That night didn't just mark the loss of a file or a ceremony, it marked the quiet collapse of something sacred. The trust that had once held their union together was gone, reduced to smoke drifting across the old stones of Windsor. When Charles finally turned to leave, the Queen remained standing, silent, unbending, illuminated by the last flicker of the dying fire. Servants would later find her there, motionless, staring into the ashes as though watching her reflection disappear. From that night on, the whispers inside the palace changed. No longer about titles or public approval, but about the woman who dared to burn the symbol of her silence. And as the years passed, many would say that Windsor never truly recovered. For on that quiet evening, the royal fire didn't just consume paper, it consumed a marriage, a crown's illusion of harmony, and the last warmth left between a king and his queen. Inside Windsor's walls, could the flames have ended more than a fire? Let's dive into the haunting silence that followed, where duty, betrayal, and truth collided in the dark. The Silent Coup. At Windsor. The silence inside Windsor that night was heavy enough to touch. The air seemed to hum with something unspoken, something that had broken just hours earlier behind the closed doors of the royal study. The palace had gone dark early, but in the west wing, a faint light still glowed. Inside, Queen Camilla sat by the window, her robe slipping loosely around her shoulders, a forgotten cup of tea cooling beside her. Her reflection in the glass looked back at her, tired, angry, humiliated. Charles's words from the argument replayed in her mind like a cruel echo. They hadn't been loud, but they had cut deep. He called her reckless, accused her of overstepping, and in that tone, the one that made her feel like she was an outsider, not the woman who had stood beside him through decades of storms. The insult didn't sting because it was new, but because it confirmed her deepest fear, that no matter what crown rested on her head, she would never truly belong. By dawn, that hurt had hardened into resolve. Camilla wasn't going to cry or plead. She was going to reclaim control, quietly, completely. Around 3 in the morning, she summoned her loyal aide, Mrs. Hill, the woman who had been with her since her Wiltshire days. Hill entered, hesitant, already sensing what was coming. Camilla's voice was calm, deliberate. "By morning," she said, "I don't want to see a single old face in this palace. Not one." And just like that, Windsor began to shift. As the first light of October crept over the gardens, staff were called, offices emptied, and long-serving attendants escorted out through the side gates. The restructuring, as the palace memo would later call it, unfolded with ruthless precision. Vans arrived quietly before breakfast. Familiar faces disappeared before anyone could whisper goodbye. And by noon, new staff, handpicked by Camilla herself, filled the halls. They were loyal, discreet, and most importantly, hers. The changes were more than cosmetic, though there were plenty of those too. Every carpet was replaced with cream gold tones she said reflected modern elegance. Every royal portrait was shifted, Charles' grand image replaced with hers. And in the space that had long honored Diana's memory, Camilla placed her own coronation portrait surrounded by roses. When one aide hesitated, she silenced him with a single sentence: "We can't keep worshipping ghosts." The palace had never seen anything like it. Some called it decisive, others whispered the word revenge. But by breakfast, when Charles received word of what had happened, even he seemed stunned. His spoon clattered against the saucer as he read the report. 6 hours. That's all it had taken. The staff gone, the portraits changed, the entire atmosphere of Windsor remade in Camilla's image. He walked the halls later that morning, past unfamiliar faces who bowed first to her before him. For the first time, Charles understood that the argument in the study hadn't just been a quarrel. It had been a warning. What he dismissed as emotion had become action. Camilla hadn't shouted, hadn't threatened. She had simply moved with quiet efficiency until the palace itself answered to her alone. In a matter of hours, Queen Camilla had done what no royal decree could. She reshaped Windsor from within. And while the papers outside would never tell the full story, those who worked behind its ancient walls whispered another name for it. A name that spread in low voices through the corridors. Imagine if those quiet whispers held the truth behind Windsor's chill. Let's dive into the secrets that turned a royal home into a kingdom divided. The fall of the Queen of Shadows. The palace had grown colder that autumn, not from the weather, but from what lingered in the air. Once filled with ceremony and grace, Windsor now felt like a fortress divided. Every corridor whispered betrayal. Every polished floor seemed to echo a quiet war. The king's health had faltered, and with it, the balance of the monarchy. His doctor had warned him to avoid stress, but how could he, when the crown itself had become his greatest burden? Inside his private chamber, King Charles sat alone, his cough breaking the silence between the chimes of the old clock. Letters lay scattered across the desk, some unsigned, others marked urgent. The ink trembled beneath his hand as he reached for the phone. "You must return, William," he said, his voice rough, almost pleading. "Your stepmother is turning the family into a stage play, and the kingdom is watching." By nightfall, a black car arrived at the gates of Windsor. No photographers, no fanfare, just the quiet hum of an engine and the soft crunch of gravel. Prince William stepped out, his coat pulled tight against the wind. The guards bowed as he passed, their eyes lowered as if even the air had learned to hold its breath. Inside, the palace felt strange to him. Unfamiliar perfumes, new paintings, and in the grand hall, the royal crest subtly shifted lower than Queen Camilla's portrait. It was as though history itself had been rearranged. He requested to see her at once. The servant who guided him looked nervous, eyes darting toward the door as though he feared what lay beyond. When the doors opened, a wave of heavy perfume rolled into the hall. Camilla sat poised, a vision of calm defiance, her hand resting lightly on the velvet armrest. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "What brings the prince back?" she asked coolly. "Or has your father grown too weak to fight his own battles?" William said nothing at first. He placed a file before her, the altered state banquet plan Charles had refused to approve. His tone was steady, cutting through the tension like glass. "I'm here to end this, Your Majesty," he said. "The palace is no longer your stage." Camilla tilted her head, amused. "You dare," she whispered. "I don't threaten," he replied. The press already knows, and Father no longer intends to protect you. For a moment, silence ruled the room. The candlelight trembled, casting long broken shadows across their faces, one representing the past, the other the uncertain future. William turned to leave, his final word sharp as the wind outside. "If you wish to keep your dignity, disappear before it's taken from you." The door shut with a sound that echoed through the corridors like a closing chapter. Camilla remained still, her fingers gripping the chairs so tightly they whitened. The queen who once commanded every corner of the palace now sat surrounded by emptiness. Outside, the clock struck 12, each chime reverberating like a warning from fate. In another wing, Charles stared out through the rain-streaked window. The paper before him bore his trembling signature. Suspend all of Queen Camilla's privileges in state affairs. It was an act that fractured him completely, but he knew it had to be done. Back in the Grand Hall, Camilla's gaze drifted toward the fireplace. The flames had died, leaving only faint embers. The scent of roses hung in the air, fading with every passing second. Around her, the walls of Windsor seemed to close in, the silence heavier than any crown. For the first time, she understood the empire she fought to control was never truly hers. And as the rain whispered against the windows, the woman who once sought to rewrite royal history was quietly being erased by it. Is this the moment everything shifted behind palace walls? Let's dive into how one headline unraveled the quiet power once held by Queen Camilla. The Silent Exile of Queen Camilla. The headlines arrived like a quiet storm, cold, careful, and heavy with meaning. Queen Camilla temporarily withdraws from all public duties, the morning papers read. The palace called it a medical leave, a short rest on her doctor's advice. But inside Windsor's shadowed halls, everyone knew better. It wasn't rest, it was removal. Behind the formal words lay a truth no one dared say aloud. The Queen had been sent away. That dawn, in the King's private office, Charles signed the decree himself. Rain tapped the window in slow, rhythmic drops as he lifted the pen, hesitated, and pressed his signature into the paper. His face gave nothing away, but those who stood nearby could feel the finality in the air. Without a word, he nodded to his secretary, and the document was sealed. By afternoon, a quiet convoy rolled out of Windsor Castle. No flags, no photographers, just the dull hum of engines heading north. Inside the car, Camilla sat still, her face bare of makeup for the first time in years. She didn't ask where they were going. She already knew. The countryside passed like a fading film. Fields, signposts, the last glimpses of a world that had once belonged to her. Every mile took her further from crowns, cameras, and courtrooms, closer to an ancient abbey in the cold Yorkshire hills. When the car stopped, the nuns were waiting, black-clad, silent, eyes kind but cautious. They bowed slightly and led her to a narrow stone room. One bed, one chair, one small window. No mirrors, no gold frames, no silk curtains. A place where even time seemed to hold its breath. "This is a peaceful house," one nun whispered. "Here, you can let go." But letting go was never Camilla's gift. She sat on the bed, staring through the misted glass at the bell tower beyond. Somewhere out there, the palace lights were still glowing. Charles's lights, William's lights, Catherine's lights. Theirs now, not hers. The woman who once stood beside a king had vanished into the gray folds of the English countryside, replaced by whispers and silence. Back in London, the narrative was already written. The Times praised Charles's composure, calling him a monarch of restraint in turbulent times. The Guardian described the decision as necessary for the stability of the crown. Camilla's name, once daily headline material, faded almost overnight. No outrage, No sympathy, just absence. Days turned to weeks. At the Abbey, Camilla spoke little, ate less, and spent long hours walking alone among the wet gardens. Once, a young nun found her standing before the statue of the Virgin Mary, eyes fixed, lips barely moving. "Do you pray, madam?" the nun asked softly. Camilla's answer came hoarse and distant. "No. I just count what I've lost." Her exile became a ghost story whispered in corridors. The queen who vanished after the Windsor scandal of 2025. The woman replaced not by another crown, but by silence. And perhaps that was the truest punishment of all. No dismissal, no disgrace, just a quiet erasure. Because in the end, it wasn't anger or rebellion that marked Camilla's downfall. It was invisible. The headlines moved on. The palace polished its image, and the bells of Yorkshire tolled faintly over the hills. Somewhere behind the abbey walls, the once queen sat by her window, listening. Each sound, the wind, the rain, the distant chime, reminds her of what the world had already forgotten. So, what do you think truly drove King Charles to banish Queen Camilla after that disastrous royal event? We'd like to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more.